Welcome to the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy. My name is Patricia McCoy, and I am the faculty director, the new faculty director of the center. It is my deep honor to introduce our Rappaport Center Senior Fellow, Danielle Sered, who will be giving today's community address. Let me also welcome the Honorable Kimberly Budd, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. It is such a deep honor to have Chief Justice here. And our other distinguished guests who sit on the SJC's Committee on Restorative Justice. One of the most vexing public policy issues today consists of failings in our criminal justice system. Today we have a system in which too often the real needs of survivors of crime, what they need and want, go unheard. Too many offenders go to prison, particularly black men, and after many inmates are released, too many of them commit crime again, which heightens the level of violent crime. Danielle Sered, our senior fellow today, is one of the leading thinkers in the country on how to untie this Gordian knot. She is the founder and director of the organization Common Justice, which advances solutions to criminal violence. Common Justice puts survivors first, and then it asks the question, how can we reduce violence and incarceration at the same time? How can we center survivors and their needs while assuring greater racial equity in the criminal justice system? Unlike many popular discussions of these questions, Danielle never takes no for an answer. Instead, she has devoted her life to fighting for alternatives to prison that better serve survivors while reducing violent offenses and the racial injustice connected with incarceration. Danielle received her BA from Emory University and her master's degrees from New York University and Oxford University, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She is the author of this outstanding and thought-provoking book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. I heartily commend it to you. This book was honored with the Award for Journalism from the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice and selected by the National Book Foundation for its Literature for Justice recognition. Danielle has been recognized countless times for her work and has served on the New York Governor's Council on Reentry and Community Reintegration, among other honors. In 2012, meanwhile, her organization, Common Justice, received the Award for Innovation in Victim Services from the Federal Office for Victims of Crime. Danielle has been featured widely in public conversations about mass incarceration, survivors, and violence, including the Aspen Ideas Festival, the Atlantic Magazine Summit on Race and Justice, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, on Democracy Now!, NPR, and on, last but not least, on Second Thought with Trevor Noah. And without further ado, let me give you our Rappaport Center Senior Fellow, Danielle Sered.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that immensely generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to join you and just the incredibly warm welcome. I really value so much all of your time and appreciate you being here. I'll say a little bit to give you a context of, a little more context of the program that underlies some of what you just heard about in our work, about the work Common Justice does, the organization I lead. At the core of it, we operate an alternative to incarceration for serious and violent felonies. It's a 15-month intervention rooted in restorative justice principles. It's one in which the people responsible for crime have the opportunity to come together with those they've hurt, acknowledge the impact, reach agreements to make things as right as possible, and if they are successful, have the felony charges against them dismissed. In the meantime, we provide wraparound services to the people who've been harmed. That work came out of it. I started planning in 2006. We launched in 2008. And it came out of an understanding that if we wanted to end mass incarceration in this country, we had to deal with the issue of violence. Part of that is numerical. More than half of the people incarcerated in the United States are incarcerated for violent crimes. And so we won't see transformative reductions in incarceration if we leave violence alone. But part of it has to do with culture and stories and power as well, which is that I know the reason we build jails instead of schools and jails instead of roads and jails instead of public health infrastructure or whatever else we might want is because we've been sold a story of some imagined monstrous other against whom we have to be protected at any cost, financial, moral, communal, at any cost. And what I know too is that trimming things at the edges is not how you keep something from growing. I'm not great at plant care, but my friends who are always trimming their things. If you want to take something down, you address its root. And we understood violence and the fundamentally racist story this country has wrapped around violence as the root of mass incarceration and the place where our work would have to be situated if we were to displace it. But we also understood I come to this work as a survivor. I've lost loved ones to murder. I've survived sexual violence and other forms of harm. And so I also know the answer is not to simply do less or do nothing, but to do something better. And so we set about a project of displacing it. On top of that work, we built a body of narrative work, a body of organizing and policy work, a body of national work that includes incredible partners like Jesus up here. Now people are going to bother you afterwards. I apologize. But all of this means that I think a lot about violence and its remedies, a lot about the criminal legal system in America, and a lot about building power for the world we all deserve. Today, I'm not going to talk about that program we operate. There are plenty of places you can see that content. I'm happy to share more about how to access it. And instead today, I'm going to try and connect all of this to democracy and to what we're seeing in this moment. These are dark times. We have seen Chicago, we have seen Los Angeles, we are watching Minneapolis, and everywhere else this is happening at a smaller scale, and wherever is next. And there's light everywhere. In all my years of organizing, I have never seen this many people coming alive, this many people saying yes and to a moment that requires everything of all of us. As Jumaane Williams said, he's the public advocate in New York, at Zohran Mamdani's inauguration for mayor in New York. He said, he talked about these uncertain times, and he said, that's the thing about uncertainty. Anything can happen. So anything can happen, right? And so before I dive in, as a spoiler or a disclaimer, I should say I am sorry to report that common justice will not save democracy. No one thing will. We are each fully and completely inadequate alone. And I would invite you for a moment to feel your inadequacy, to know that that's true. You are not enough. And together we're enough. We are and have all that is needed to win. And I invite us to feel that too, because both of those truths matter immensely to how we navigate what's ahead of us. Today, in thinking about the state of democracy in America, I want to acknowledge that the struggle around immigration is absolutely electric right now. And I both am and am not talking about immigration today. Because today I want to talk mostly about one side of struggle, the one I know best and that I think is of interest to many of you here, which is the criminal justice system and what I think it has to do with the fight of our lives. We're facing unprecedented challenges to this country's long, fragile experiment in democracy, and there are countless risks we have to manage. And one central risk I think we have to have in view is our underestimation of the importance of the criminal justice system in securing a multiracial democracy. I think very often we think of criminal justice as sort of more ancillary to other central dimensions of functioning civil society. Things like the protection of voting rights, freedom of speech, adherence to the Constitution, even the assurance of meeting people's basic material needs, all of those. And this sector is often regarded as sort of morally desirable, but not quite necessary to democracy, right? As a body of work that implicates only a small segment of our society, and maybe a segment that we only some of us are obligated to care about. That orientation, in my view, vastly misunderstands the scope and the role of the criminal legal system in a democracy. So for instance, that orientation can obscure the fact that ICE agents are law enforcement, that they are immigration police, and ICE detention is jail, and that the stories that drive this enforcement are built on the foundation of mass incarceration in America. We'll get a little more to that later. And so today I hope to offer an invitation to reorient toward this work and its impacts in our shared future. And so I'll talk about 4 key dimensions of this, and then maybe say a few words about what I think comes next. Spoilers, I think we're going to win. So the first dimension I want to talk about is that the criminal justice system is where other movements end up when they lose. Repressive governments deploy criminalization to control people and culture. That's what they do. And ours, we know, is actively criminalizing immigration, reproductive health care, the expression of queer and trans identities, educating about race and history, protest, voting rights, all of it. And when those kinds of repressive laws take effect, the behaviors don't evaporate. And it's people who are criminalized. People who still immigrate, people who still seek abortion, people who are still queer and trans and visibly so, teachers who still educate their students, people still protest, people still exercise their rights to vote. And so what happens is not that those behaviors go away or that those people go away, but that those things become punishable. And they're punished by the same police forces, the same prosecutors, the same judges, parole boards. They're governed by the same bail statutes and sentencing guidelines, sent to the same jails and prisons, brought to the same parole, probation supervision that are known all too well to those of us who work on criminal justice. Prohibition doesn't eradicate behavior, it subjects it to punishment. And whether and how the criminal legal system punishes people for their behaviors that are being targeted right now will determine a lot of whether we are facing a concentrated period of escalated hardship or a regressive cultural transformation that will harm people, communities, and our democracy for generations to come. And so to put it a little differently, like criminalization is how fascism does fascism. What this means for you and for us, in my view, is that everywhere is a site of struggle, which means also that everywhere is a site of possibility, that every instance of criminalization is part of that larger whole, that every place we contend for power and for people's freedom is part of this larger fabric. And so that includes resistance to ICE. Immigration enforcement is its own beast in some ways, but as we've started to see, it becomes entirely entangled with the criminal legal system when people start to meet it with resistance. Most protests and acts of solidarity will eventually become the business of the criminal legal system. And how that system responds will shape immensely how many people feel they can take the risk to join resistance movements. It will matter most of all if we survive, if we are killed for what we're doing. But then after that, it will matter greatly if people protesting face a few hours in prison, a few hours in jail, or a few years. Right? Like what consequences are imposed matters enormously to all of our risk calculus. And those consequences are going to be largely determined in the criminal legal system. And so this is a time to develop an attention, a commitment to understanding and pushing back on the immigration enforcement apparatus in this country like never before, to understanding it as a form of policing. But it is not a time to turn away from these systems that carry out the day-to-day criminalization and enforcement. And as people in power try and consolidate and quell resistance, all of this is coming to these systems. Those of us that have worked in these for a long time know how strange and brutal the machinery can be. And we also know ways to put cogs in the wheels, to slow it, to stop it, even to derail it. We need all those lessons now. Having worked in the criminal legal system for nearly 20 years now, I know how intractable it can be. And I also know there is discretion everywhere. And everywhere there is discretion, there is a person, right? There's a person with values, with priorities, with relationships. There's a person who is susceptible to the influence of power, good or bad, whether that influence is from above or from the people. And the thing about discretion is also that anything is possible, including the grave disparities that we know characterize the system as we know it, and in also including its possible deployment as an instrument of fascism. But anything is possible, right? Courts can also be places that help hold the line across a wide range of issues and refuse to enforce dehumanizing distortions of the law, right? Like both of those are very much before us, and which we're going to see most has yet to be tested, yet to be known. And so people and organizations in the criminal legal reform field and movement have built long-standing analysis, strategy, coalition, bases of support that have poised us to push back against some of the most harmful expressions of authoritarianism that will play out in our sector. And like, this is our moment. Like, we'll have to be nimble, intersectional, interdisciplinary, resourced. But if we are, we can play an indispensable role in the defense of the people and institutions that are under attack. And so please, if you haven't, join us. Like, if you are in these systems, if you are near them, if you are interested in them, that it's time for us to get into formation and get ready to leverage everything we have to win. The second dimension of this connection between the criminal legal system and democracy I want to talk about today are the dynamics of fear and repression. And I said this a little about this at the beginning in talking about why we started Common Justice. But an integral element of the rise of repressive regimes is their narrative around safety. Those regimes have to control the story of who is dangerous, who is endangered, who should do protecting, and how. That's true across geography, across history. And unfortunately, a very significant groundwork laid for this in this country. The narrative, the stories being employed by this federal administration now and its allies build on long-standing narratives in this nation. They have long been counterfactual, fear-mongering, and racist. They weaponize anti-Blackness in our culture to support increases in criminalization and policing and incarceration that include not only Black people, but other marginalized groups amongst their targets, most notably in this moment, immigrant communities, but certainly not only there. And one thing we've learned in our work at Common Justice is that we don't build prisons for safety. They don't produce safety. We build prisons because of that story I talked about. We build prisons because of the story we hold about who is dangerous and what we're willing to do to allegedly be safe. And if we don't come for that narrative, then no amount of reforms at the edges will take hold or turn into any meaningful change. So we have to pay attention not only to the stories we're hearing about, quote, violent illegal aliens, end quote, criminals that are being deployed as the justification for extraordinary, brutal force being directed at all immigrants everywhere in this country. Just like the narrative in the criminal justice sector, it's the fuel for far broader enforcement than just against people who've committed violence, right? We're seeing that clearly right in front of us. It's the story that sets the limits of what we'll tolerate from our systems of enforcement, and everyone in those systems ends up subject to those limits, or the lack of limits in most cases. And so whatever we allow for violent criminals, we ultimately allow for everyone. Minneapolis should have taught us this if we didn't already know. And we should have already known. So the lesson isn't to try and draw this distinction between violent and non-violent people better, to somehow get better at drawing the line. The lesson is that the distinction is a myth. It's a trick. And that even when we deploy it with good intentions, it always harms people who have committed violence, and it always ends up harming people who have not by enabling mechanisms of enforcement that we never would have otherwise tolerated. So the lesson is not to double down on this binary, but to get out of it entirely and to step in a place where we insist on the humanity and the rights of everyone. And this isn't just about policy. If we're really going to win, we have to be clear that we won't win policy or elections if we don't also win culture. If we don't contend for narrative control, we risk losing our chances of regaining power amongst the electorate for the foreseeable future. People will vote based on fear of crime, of immigrants, of standing up. And it'll cement the policies and leaders that will implement harshest punishments, not just for violent crime, but for the vast growing range of criminalized behavior, including things like protest. The narrative battle on violence is winnable. We won't win by denying people's fears, by relying on data, by focusing on the harms of incarceration, or by seeking the perfect message that will turn the masses. Sadly, we know that it doesn't work. We have to disentangle the fear-mongering from the real lived experience of violence that underlie people's desire for safety, and acceptance of law enforcement is the way to achieve it. And so that means we have to validate people's experience of violence of when it occurs, acknowledge the harm is real and consequential, and at the same time make sure we're not applying that to some broad range of imagined fears. In the instance where violence does happen, we have to uplift the voice of crime survivors who want real solutions. We have to stand on the side of accountability. I mean that as distinct from punishment. So one of the things I've learned long in this work now is that we use the word punishment and accountability synonymously, and the more I do this work, the more I understand not only are they not synonymous, they're antithetical. You know, that punishment is passive. Punishment is something that is done to us. All we have to do to be punished is not escape. Accountability is active. It requires we acknowledge what we've done, we acknowledge its impact, we express genuine remorse, we make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and we become someone who will never do it ever again. It's extremely hard work. It is an act of love. I believe it is our terrain and not theirs, and it's time that we claim it as our own. And in talking about violence, we have to offer an affirmative vision of a world where safety is delivered by common sense solutions that actually work, practices that are sufficiently resourced to meet people's needs in acute moments of crisis and over the long term. And so that means we don't just reduce incarceration, we displace it. And those efforts stand to draw support from people who would otherwise not join us. I think the work of defending against the worst of what is happening is sacred work in my view, but if we aren't also building, we will not win. Like one of my mentors growing up in Chicago taught me it is hard to get people to fight for a shit sandwich, easy on the shit. And I think there's a lesson for all of us in that as we think about organizing. And then, of course, as we talked about, we cannot distinguish between people who commit violence and nonviolent crimes in all of this, in terms of who's deserving of reform, of fairness, of opportunity. Because if there are people who are undeserving, all of us will be among them soon enough. If we say violent people can be punished brutally, we have to remember protest is already being characterized as violent. We saw this with Renee Good. We saw it with Alex Preddy. We will see it with more and more. So the narrative change work we're talking about is extraordinarily consequential. And it's not just media and large platform, like narrative happens in relationship, including each of our relationships with each other, with our families, with our neighbors. And so this is work that all of us can, and I think very urgently have to do. We have to tell different stories and ones that align with the world we want. The third dimension I want to lift up between the criminal legal system and democracy has to do with the vulnerability of local governance. I find this one very stressful. So there's this ongoing struggle between the autonomy of local governance that's been increasingly contested in the criminal justice arena, and we should expect those tactics to escalate in the months and years ahead. And so I want to talk about what this looks like in a criminal justice context first, where a lot of this has long been tested. So across the country, and this dates back to before the last presidential election, but has only escalated, predominantly white conservative legislators have been using strategies reminiscent of the Jim Crow era to undermine the self-governance of majority black cities. So some of the most salient examples of this include cities that have elected more reform-minded prosecutors, where their constituents want to see a reduction in a reliance on incarceration and cash bail, hold police accountable. They elect a district attorney or whatever the local prosecutor is called in their jurisdiction to do that. And those elected officials have faced enormous backlash from authoritarian governors and state legislators as part of a coordinated effort to usurp local power, right? And so people in different states are testing this. They are talking to one another. They are rolling out different strategies. They have been doing this for quite some time. And over the past 5 years, More than 30 states have tried to pass bills that would strip discretion from democratically elected prosecutors and judges. This is going on everywhere where our attention is drawn to kind of broader and flashier struggles. And taken together, the changes carried out by these governors and state legislatures would put white conservative state officials in control of much of the criminal legal system across a significant swath of communities populated by Black and brown people. We see that in the displacement of the elected prosecutor in St. Louis, where the acting prosecutor was then named by the white state governor and put in place without any popular election. We see it in Jackson, Mississippi, where they created a separate capital district within Jackson to be governed by a separate court system with separate penalties, and where all the judges in that system were appointed by the state instead of by the people of Jackson, and that still drew on Jackson tax dollars, right? We see it everywhere. And the real stakes of this are not just criminal justice, right? They're carried out there, but it's a testing ground for the feasibility of this. And I think we were sounding the warning call of this before November 2024. I feel sometimes I think we should have an I told you so party where everyone gets to say to be like, I said this, and everyone can say, you did tell us, and then we like throw something on a fire and then move on. I'd have a few contributions, as would many of us. And so, I mean, what it means is that these strategies, if we let them go, are the basis to revoke queer and trans rights, to target immigrants, to limit teachings about race, racism, DEI, abortion, protest, voting, all of it, right? They're not just about criminal justice. And so the real stakes are democracy, but because they're carried out as fights about criminal justice, we have to be engaged in both fights at the same time. We have to understand that our sector is where these things are being tested, because our opposition accurately judges that the left will cave on criminal justice before we cave on other things, right? And certainly Democrats will. Like, Democrats are still remembering Bill Clinton with his crime bill and his saxophone. You know, like, it's not, the model of it is not one that poises us well to resist these kinds of things, and we will face really significant consequences of the precedents those things will set if we don't. And so we think about this as preemption. We should understand that the central debate about where power lies in this moment in our nation, when the federal government is behaving so anti-democratically, is around these questions of the relationship between local, state, federal power. And so we see those in the debates about the National Guard, right? There's struggles for local control in the face of incursions of power to higher level, whether that's the state usurping local power, the federal government usurping state power, right? All of these things are playing out in front of us. And what we know from experience historically and globally, and from people leading our national struggle now, is that democracy will be protected locally. Orders will come down, and people will have to comply or not, right? And they'll decide that. That means, like, the orders will come in, a mayor will or won't comply, a police commissioner, a school superintendent, a teacher, a police officer, a judge, right? All these things will happen. And whether people comply or not will have to do with what they see when they face their constituencies. What do they feel pressured to do? What do they feel protected in doing? And so the hyper-local organizing will determine everything about whether the inevitably dehumanizing orders that come down are carried out or are stopped. And so we have to be building this power, and that means we have to be doing that at community boards, at school boards, at library boards, county commissioner seats, all of it. The right has been doing this for a generation. It's our time. And it's not only about pushing back now, but it's about building a durable base of power for the future that is still ours to win. Because, like, I really don't want to do fascism every 4 years. Like, it's too much. You may have the energy for it. Some of the students here, I'm too old for that shit. And so, like, enough is enough. We had enough going on before this. And so these local sites are going to be really key sites of resistance. And so it means, like, you don't have to fly to Minneapolis. You don't have to go to DC, right? You find the people where you are, and you join together and refuse the things that are otherwise being demanded of you, even if all that's being demanded is your complicity, is your silence, is looking away. That is a huge demand, right? The demand for silence is an enormous demand. And I think we see this in Minneapolis, right? We see it as an extraordinary local thing, right, is a thing that is rooted in their identity, in their place, where they are. The protests are as important as those are the people who are checking on their neighbors, who are delivering food, the sex shop that turned into a food distribution center, the pizza shop that for every pizza someone ordered, they delivered one for free to someone else, right? All of these things are part of that network, right? So we want to understand it as everything from litigation to checking on our neighbors, right? That all of those things are part of it. And in all of this, we can't forget how much of criminal enforcement depends on local courts, on police, on jails, and how much of our attention has to remain there, even as there are 1,000 things for us to look at, from Minneapolis to the Epstein files to whatever else is in your algorithm. Finally, the last dimension of the connection I want to speak about is this thing of offering a real affirmative vision for winning on safety. So this piece is related to the issue of narrative, but it's not just about narrative. It's about people's actual experiences. We will not win a popular majority in this country unless we can win on safety, right? Unless we can actually deliver it. Moving people toward a public safety approach that's consistent with human dignity, with multiracial democracy, will require real, pragmatic solutions that make people feel a difference in their day-to-day lives. That means people have to be safer and feel safer. And that means they need to see and feel approaches to violence that make sense to them, that deliver the results they've long sought. So this means expanding community violence interruption programs, restorative justice and transformative approaches to harm, truly community-based diversion programs, crisis response teams that function independent of law enforcement, harm reduction approaches to substance use, all of that. And these approaches exist, and they aren't just more just, they are also more effective. I mean, I've spent nearly 20 years running one, and I can say over time I've only become more confident in common justice's work, where, for example, only 8% of our people have been terminated for new crimes, and a 10-year analysis of our graduates, only one had been convicted of a violent felony, and that was just possession of a weapon. Like, find me one prison that can do that, and I'll go home. And then the expansion of this sector over the last decade has been totally extraordinary and electric to be part of. And that includes the expansion of community violence interrupter work, which has always existed, but it's increasingly organized, it's resourced, it's recognized. It includes the development of more alternatives to responding to people in mental health crises, from like local mutual aid efforts to much bigger citywide efforts, like what's getting built out finally and well in New York City. It includes prevention, interruption, intervention, transformation work, all of it. And these strategies are increasingly diversified, they have grown, they have evidence, they have strong support, and they have support among people who otherwise would support tough on crime responses. And so in the coming years, it'll be all the more urgent that we secure the support for these so people can feel the material differences in their life that come from having real solutions. And then, relatedly, safety is not just about the absence of violence, but the presence of needed supports, right? Like, it's relational, it's communal, it's structural. As Ruthie Wilson Gilmore teaches us, abolition is not about absence, but presence, right? It's why Minneapolis's work to abolish ICE looks like people being present in every possible way in the face of brutality. And like the rest of it, it's both hyperlocal and national all at once. And so we understand like the sweeping cuts to things like Medicaid and housing and all of that are things that undermine safety. And so the work of safety also requires defending those resources, right, as things that do far more than any police force will ever do to keep a neighborhood safe. And still, we also know that a significant portion of people where crime rates have declined still report feeling less safe. So the actual instances matter, but so does the feeling of it. And that's partly because safety has to do with feelings of agency and connection. Like, we want to feel like we can protect ourselves and be protective, that we can shape our own lives, that we know the people around us and that the people around us care for us. And so our organizing strategies around safety also have to embed things that connect neighbors to one another, that build shared power, that anchor us in our sense of belonging to each other. And so to the degree that that organizing can foster these deeper and lasting experiences of belonging, it will form the basis for powerful alignment on collective action and will win. And so one core discipline, I think, that we can bring to this work is that we cannot spend the majority of our time just fighting things as they are. We have to make broadly accessible a vision of things as they can be. It goes back to the shit sandwich, easy on the shit. And that's especially important in this political moment where these fights related to criminalization and incarceration are entwined with all the larger fights in front of us. And so it means we have to not just break down, but we have to build. We have to build the institutions we want, the solutions we need, the power to secure them. We have to offer an irresistible world that is worth fighting for, and it has to include contending with the criminal legal system's place in our society and with every form of policing that it takes. And that's not all we have to do. It's just what I believe we have to do in this area and why we can't risk turning from it, even now. A little of what I think is coming or should come. I think the battles ahead of us are winnable. I believe that we will win. I believe that more than I have for the last year and change. And we will do a grave generational disservice to this democracy and to the people if we concede anything in advance. So one of the first lessons of resisting authoritarianism is you don't obey in advance. You don't give anything up based just on intimidation. You don't give anything for free. Like you have to make them take, it has to cost them. Everything they take has to come with a price. Like the political margins are narrow, they're precarious in ways that are increasingly in our favor. And our capacity for building movement is expansive, and if we do a good job, it is expanding. Like we have a real chance now of minimizing the immediate harm to people who will suffer the greatest losses in this time, and to building a basis for a multiracial democracy that can withstand the pressures of division and threaten collapse. But I'll also say there isn't a later time if we don't act now. Like we are quickly backsliding from democracy into authoritarianism. And the cohesion amongst those who would corrode democracy is slipping. Like cracks are appearing everywhere, ones we've created through our own resistance and one of their own making and fuckery that reveal the fragility of their alliances. And so we have work to do everywhere. We have to be everywhere. We have to come alive rather than despair. And on the one hand, it matters so much what we do. Like the stakes can't be higher. And also more and more, I'm convinced it doesn't matter what we do as long as we are not frozen and we are not alone. Fascism needs us frozen and alone. And so I would say don't belabor too long thinking about what's needed. Like do the next good thing. Like if there's a good thing you can see to do, do it. And when I look out in the world, I see more and more people every day who are not frozen and not alone. People are in motion everywhere, and we are not alone. And we can't be persuaded that the possible is impossible. I think the introduction said, I don't take no for an answer. That is fair. And what I know is like when you think something's possible, you have to be fervent, you have to be stubborn, you have to be completely unpersuaded that it can't be done. Like it can be done. We have to take nothing for granted. Like we have to analyze what prevents it honestly. We have to address those barriers. We have to build power. We have to win. And this is true for the small local battles. It's true for something like transforming the criminal justice system. And it's true for something like building the first multiracial democracy this country will ever have seen. So I'll close with two other things that I think those of us with experience in restorative justice and transformative justice have to offer in this time. And one is the value of reckoning. We're at a moment in this country where we're not going to be able to move forward without dealing with our past. I think we've long been at that moment. It's part of why we've collapsed into where we are. We've avoided it too long, and we have to steer into it because there is no way out or around. And the thing I will say is what I've learned from being in various processes of reckoning is that they're hard, they're painful. It's like crossing a river of fire and no one wants to do it. But that is what is possible on the other side of that is never fully visible from this side. We just have to go through it. And the other thing we know is how necessary repair is. I think a relationship without capacity for repair can't survive. An organization without capacity for repair can't survive. A movement without capacity for repair can't survive. A nation without capacity for repair can't survive. And so we're going to have to learn how to do repair. And I've said I think we'll win, and so it's also worth us starting to think about what we'll do when we win. Like how will we hold people accountable who've caused terrible harm in this time in a way that still aligns with our values? How will we make repair to those harm? Like how will we carve a road forward in the aftermath of all of this where we can still live together? Like, this is the kind of moment that really makes you not envy Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War. Like, talk about a tight spot. And so, like, these things are answerable, but they're not obvious, like, at least not to me. And so I think it's time for us to think about them together. And so I want to close with the story of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. This is the corniest thing a person can do, arguably. There's like Hallmark cards, and the caterpillar became a butterfly. It's terrible. But has anyone seen it? Have you seen what that looks like? So in the Natural History Museum in New York, there's a butterfly room. You go there. If you're still enough, they'll land on your head. It's wonderful. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. And on the side, now they've put a better display case. When I first went there 20 years ago, the display case was this like old weird wooden box where you can see the various stages of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. I don't know all the words. I think one of them is chrysalis. It's very pretty. I don't know which stage it applies to, but it's knowable. I'm sure AI could tell you. But what happens is it's not like the little fuzzy caterpillar just like drops its fur and sprouts wings. Like they disintegrate, they liquefy. It smells like some combination of death and ass. Like it's disgusting. And most of them don't make it. And you don't see even a hint of the wings until like the very end. I've long wanted like big pictures on my wall of those stages, because what I know from our work, what I know from healing through violence in my own life, from standing along so many people who've caused and survived such terrible harm, is that like transformation is nasty. Like it's hard. And at the same time, it's the only way. And so to me, I'm like, let's disintegrate, let's smell like death. Let's feel everything we've ever known end and tolerate as best we can. And let's see if we can become something else. I don't think we have any other options left. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Danielle. So just as importantly as it is for us to hear from Danielle's prepared remarks, it is important for us to get questions. Here at the Rappaport Center, we always begin with students first, but we also invite others to participate as well. One thing that I want to emphasize now is that this session is being recorded. And let me open up the floor let's have our students begin, show our visitors how engaged we are, and then we can pass the mic around. And we're going to use the mic because we have a ton of people on Zoom watching, and they need to be able to hear your good questions too. So who wants to begin? Don't be shy. Sorry, I got to run fast. There's only one mic. That's why I need to wear sneakers.
First, thank you so much for being here. And second, I'll see you at 5 p.m. in restorative justice. So with that, I've read part of your book. And part that really stuck out to me was when you were talking about from the beginning, like the first interaction that clients have with their defense attorney is to sometimes deny, and often the first words said are, "How do you plead? Not guilty." I'm going to be a criminal defense attorney way too soon, in like 9 months. And I was kind of wondering what your input is on how, as a criminal defense attorney, a baby attorney specifically, you can kind of navigate protecting your clients, but also really promoting this in your work and accountability. And yeah, that's my question.
It's a great question. Thank you for being a defense attorney. It's a hard and sacred job in my view. I mean, I think it's a really hard question because I do not think the criminal legal system is built for accountability, right? Because there is nothing in it for people who tell the truth about what they do, but more punishment for having done that, right? And so I don't think there are things you can do in your fervent advocacy for your client unless there are restorative justice options. And the defense attorneys, you're in a relationship with your clients. And so they will tell you probably more than they'll tell anyone what they actually did, right? Because you'll need to know to represent them. And how you hold those conversations can matter. You can ask them do you ever think about that person? If you could say something to that person, what would you say? And then they'll tell you, and you say, whatever you do, don't say that on the record. But you can encourage them to think that, and you can invite it, and you can help them draw a distinction between what the best posture for them is going to be in a courtroom, especially one where 97% of cases will be resolved by plea, and what the best posture for them is as a person. And you can help them understand that the court is a place where the consequences for this are going to be determined in terms of the violation of a law, but it's not the place that's going to determine the consequences in terms of the violation of relationship and of another person. And you can invite them to think about that, right? And make some room for it. My experience is that in doing that, that's fundamentally dignifying for people. Like, people know what they've done and people know it's wrong. And when there's space to kind of acknowledge that and be with that and consider something that, might look like repair, that it's almost always welcome and something is almost always possible. Yeah.
Thank you again for coming here, speaking here today. So in those different dimensions you talked about, one thing that kept being repeated was lived experiences and this idea of like truth and rawness that you can get from, like, I guess, hoping to create that narrative. And my question is, like, how do you envision like the best way to go about that is also like protecting like survivors' dignity as well, and how do you balance those two types of things? And I know that's so important for restorative justice as well. So
it would be so helpful to shifting narrative if everyone we knew who engaged in transformative processes talked about it. And the problem is, like, the world doesn't yet deserve those stories. It treats, like, the people who acknowledge they committed harm, it treats them terribly for it. Like, folks in common justice work so hard to know the felony their record. It is not actually smart for them to create a permanent public record that acknowledges they had a violent felony, right? And for our survivors, sometimes it takes them a year to even be forthcoming with us about what happened. They haven't always even told their families. So to expect them to share that with a world where, in my experience, if I share my experience as a survivor, most people are like, thank you so much for saying so. They're like, well, was it something? Do you have any scars? Like, people are crazy. Like, people are greedy with those stories. And so I think it's a hard balance to strike. I think if you work with survivors collectively, if you build collective power and let people think through their own risk calculus for themselves, I think it's the only way to do it. That you're really direct about what might happen one way or another. People are like, you know what? And others will be like, that price seems fine compared to prices I've already paid for harder things. And so I think the real thing is to make sure you're extremely transparent and that you let people's answers change. They change, right? Like, you let it stay dynamic. And that people do it together. That, like, here's this one survivor's story. Like, it's horrific. Like, here's 15 survivors who all share an experience and are saying some version of the same thing. And I think the more people move collectively, the safer people are, both in terms of like potential collateral consequences and in terms of the emotional experience of like offering up their own thing for the transformation of the world.
thank you for those things.
So you talked about how you think we're in a political space where we can win, that we can offer a pragmatic approach to safety. But you've also said that prisons don't make us safe. So do you think that that message aligns with political success and victory? And if not, what's the message of safety that we put forth?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question. So I think in 2020, we get this huge wave of appetites for reform that are a real credit to the Black Lives Matter organizing, to decades of organizing that prepared for that moment. And we see all sorts of things. We see criminal justice reform. We see, Target has his 15 minutes of doing DEI, right? Like, all these things happen. And then, like, fairly soon, white America is like, that was a lot. and starts to pull back on most of those gains, right? And what I will say is that I feel like it's like the one thing that got washed up on the shore when the tide went back out, like, you know, if like a shell gets washed up or a rock and is left there, is this appetite for actual solutions, right? And so 90% of people who are offered common justice say yes to it. Like fewer than half of victims don't call the police in the first place. Another half don't make it past grand jury. And we're talking to the jailing is subset of victims. And amongst those, people who've had guns to their heads, who've been shot at, like all of these things. And they don't say yes mostly out of mercy. Right? They say yes out of pragmatism. Like as survivors, the two things we can't stand are the idea of going through it again and the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And so when we're presented with options, we choose the thing that we think will prevent what we can't stand. And we can choose that even while being furious. Right? Like when I used to do outreach to survivors, one of the survivors who ultimately chose to have the person who hurt him come to common justice said to me, fuck him, but fuck jail. I've long wanted to write an essay where that's the whole essay, and then it's like 70 pages of footnotes to support the legitimacy of each claim, because they're both like really solid. And I think people understand that, right? I think we often say like, we go from like tough on crime to just being like, everyone has to have a heart overflowing with mercy and just be like, each person who's done harm was once a baby and so was I, you know, and it's like, yes, and you want to be safe and violence is wrong and you have to address harm and all these other things. And so I think there's a place, like I think the most radical position in the criminal justice system would be that everything we do in response to violence has to be something that reduces violence. That seems not terrible. It would change how we do bail, it would change sentencing, it would change diversion, it would change everything. If we just decided we're only going to respond to violence with things that reduce violence. And so I think there's a way out of this kind of tough and soft dynamic into something else. Like you can't predict in the absence of options what people will choose in the presence of options. And that has to do with organizing, building power too. So most of the time what happens when Black and brown communities impacted by violence make demands is people in community will say, we want schools, we want green space, we want the street lights fixed, we want police, we want mental health centers, we want after school centers, we want affordable grocery stores. And then the city or state will be like, oh, did you say you wanted police? Here you go. Right? And over time, people stop making demands for all the things that are never met and understood that there's one demand that will be met and repeat that demand. Whereas if you build full collective power, people can demand all those things. And if people have more experience of winning any of them, then their investment in continuing to fight for more of it only grows. And so we also don't get out of any of this, in my view, without actually building a base, like building power among people. Like we have to organize, because policy isn't durable. Like you win policy, it's great. Tides change, next week it's gone, or you're spending $5 million to defend a campaign that cost you $1 million to win. It's not sustainable. The only thing that will win in our sector and the only thing that will defend democracy is real base building. And I think there is a genuine appetite for things that work. And I think when we get out of this weird dichotomy into actually offering other things, that all sorts of people who have not been on the side of what we talk about reform become like ardent supporters for doing something that works.
We have time for one more short question.
Hi, thank you for your time today. It was really informative to hear everything you said and also really fulfilling, but we've been learning a lot about prosecutorial discretion in our criminal law class. And I wanted to know your take on how can prosecutorial discretion influence and also, I think, support and propel rehabilitationist efforts in the criminal legal system?
Yeah, prosecutor's discretion is wild, right? Like the range of power a prosecutor has in this country is really extraordinary because we built a system with a presumption that things would go to trial,
where things are far more balanced. But the introduction of plea bargains as the primary way cases are resolved, like, dramatically shifts power to prosecutors. I think Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn is the best prosecutor in America. I'm happy to battle anyone on this topic if you'd like. And I think there are two things I'll say about that discussion. Like, one is that office has made a commitment to using incarceration as a last resort, right? And the only reason they can make that commitment is because they have capacity to exercise discretion, right? And that gets them out of the mandatory minimums that would otherwise constrain their choices, right? If they were bound by the mandatory minimums, if they couldn't dismiss the top charge or the top 3 charges, then they'd be stuck in what policy requires of them. But because they can do that, they can come down exactly as low as they want to whenever they want to. And they've done that while simultaneously relying on an extraordinary, robust local community-based infrastructure to provide those diversion programs, right? And so also, more than most offices are not running their own stuff, right? Like, they are partnered with, reliant on that infrastructure rooted in community. And it's part of why they are so trusted and so successful. And then the other dimension of that is that prosecutors are elected and they are responsive to power. Most of them want to keep their jobs. And if they don't want to keep their jobs, they can quit. They don't have to lose. And so they're oriented around keeping their jobs. And so who elects them matters immensely as well. And so the thing that will best predict a prosecutor's behavior is the base of people who elected them. And so part of what makes Brooklyn really extraordinary is that Ken Thompson many years ago ran a campaign where he did most of the campaign work in Black and Brown Central Brooklyn. Eric Gonzalez has built on that same base. And so it means the people to whom he's accountable are people living in neighborhoods most impacted by violence. And what I know is that in neighborhoods impacted by violence, people aren't kicking you out of office because one person in a program went and committed a new crime. They know 1,000 people who didn't get caught, 1,000 people who went away and came back worse for it. Like, that one egregious case is not making or breaking a career. And so the risk calculus for an elected then becomes really oriented on actually delivering safety, not just avoiding headlines. And when that happens, there's an alignment between how democracy is operating in that space, like how power is operating, and then what that elected can do with the discretion they wield. Thank you.